Krishnamacharya, the father of this lineage of Vinyasa yoga that we are practicing. And just to set the scene, last week, we're getting towards the end now, because last week, Krishnamacharya had his 100th birthday celebration, which was a very big deal. But he ended up going to the anyway. And it was really about a celebration, not just of his life, but of the practice itself. So Krishnamacharya entered Mahasamadhi, Maha great, Samadhi liberation. In other words, he left his physical body on February the 28th, 1989. At 101 years old, he was born in 1888. So what happens now is this is his son, Desikachar, and Desikachar is going to go on pilgrimage to honor his father. Obviously, pilgrimage is a really big thing in India. Even now, it's a really massive thing in India. People are on pilgrimage all the time. The sadhus, you know what the sadhus are like, they're pretty much, because they are generally kind of like they've given up their homes and they're renunciate. And also older people who take sannyas, like people in the later stage of life, they give up their family life and their business, hand it over to the younger ones, and then they also become a kind of renunciate. And their main practice, they walk from place to place. They travel from place to place and go to holy sites, holy shrines, temples, and mountains, etc. And you see people on pilgrimage all the time. I spent some time in ashrams in the Himalayas, up north of Rishikesh, Uttarkashi, and the foothills of the Himalayas. And that road there that goes by the ashram is a pilgrimage route to Badrinath and up also to the source of the mother, Ganges. And it's just all the time, there's just people walking up that road to go on pilgrimage. And people go on pilgrimage in different ways in India. I mean, the traditional way would be to walk. It's like that Aboriginal idea of like when you want to heal someone and they're living a distance away from you, as you walk towards that person, you repeat their name with every breath and every step. And that's, what you're doing is you're giving them your prana. It's a healing action of movement. Well, pilgrimage in India is very much the same thing, because people going on pilgrimage will be using their mantra. So as they walk, with every step or every breath, they repeat their mantra. And so the mantra is like taking them closer to God in whatever form they are manifest for them, but also the form that they're walking towards. So if they were going to Mount Kailash on pilgrimage, their mantra, they would be Shiva. They would be chanting for Shiva. It's also a very important place for Buddhists. So the Buddhists would do that pilgrimage and repeat Om Mani Padme Hum as they walk. And sometimes people don't walk. Sometimes people crawl. And sometimes people roll for weeks on end. And sometimes people do up and down, flat on the floor, arms over the head. You know the full prostration we do in the sun salutation? It's the first part of that. They do that continually for weeks on end sometimes to get to the place of pilgrimage. Some people go in air-conditioned buses. Yeah, so take your pick. Anyway, to the story. 4 years after my father's death, I set out with 3 American friends on the most ambitious pilgrimage of my life. Our destination was Mount Kailash. It's in the Himalayas of Western Tibet. The mountain is the abode of Lord Shiva, who gave yoga to humanity, and the lake is the place where my father had arrived 80 years earlier to begin his profound studies of yoga with Sri Ramamohan Brahmachari, the guru who taught Krishnamacharya in a cave for 7 years. We were also headed for the region where lies the source of the Ganga, known in the West as the River Ganges. From droplets in ice caves, from tiny rivulets, and from seasonal floods and melting snow, this great and holiest of spring course through northern India that culminates in the Bay of Bengal. Barely discernible at the beginning of its journey, the Ganga takes on the force that becomes irresistible, that has laid waste to cities and monuments of the past. The Ganga is also ever renewing for the land and people along its path, and for the spiritual nature of India itself. We are all familiar with the ancient saying, you can never step into the same river twice. Everything is always in a state of change. It is equally true that whenever you step into a river, you are always bathed by that river. Whether you step in the Ganga near its origin, the banks of a tiny village, or one of the cities along its route, Allahabad, Benares, or Calcutta, for example, you become part of the timeless flow of the Ganga. It is the same with that enduring stream of knowledge known as parampara. Whenever we make contact with the lineage of teachers, from reading or chanting the works of the ancients to a yoga class in a modern city, we touch upon the entirety of that wisdom. Paying homage to the source of inspiration in our lives is irresistible to those who understand, perhaps instinctively, the nature of pilgrimage. For me, the journey to Western Tibet was to honor my father's memory and also to renew my sense of belonging to the teachings of his parampara, his lineage. Whenever there was a problem in our family, or I had questions about my teaching or a new challenge, I could always talk to him. I was very happy to be a good student and go-between. And then Krishnamacharya was no longer there to console as readily as before. This loss I felt very deeply, and I wanted to feel closer to his presence. Where better than his own source of inspiration and wisdom? Despite the difficulties, we set out for the place where Krishnamacharya became a go-between between man and God. And I'm going to skip a bit now. This is where that actually, they kind of wander around a little bit, and they go to Lhasa, and they go to the Pota, and they go to the Buddhist places and temples, and then because it's such a sacred pilgrimage site, the Chinese put on buses, and it's like a bus tour that you can go on. Deskachar didn't want to do it that way. He wanted to see the country, he wanted to meet the people. So they hire two jeeps or whatever, and then they take a circuitous route more along small paths and rivers and stuff like that to get there, which is more closer to the route that Krishnamacharya did on foot when he was in his 20s. It still took them 12 days in a jeep. After 12 days of camping and traveling, we came to Kailash, which is like no other mountain of the Himalayas. A high projection rises between two peaks, each with a distinctive profile, one side reflecting brilliant sunshine off its snowy surface, the other pure white. Here we left the traditional offerings of stones to the goddesses, testament to centuries of pilgrimages, where the millions upon millions of stones left by the worshippers at Mount Kailash and Lake Manasarovar. At the lake, we were first disappointed because there seemed to be no caves. The slopes of the mountains were either too muddy or too hard and too rocky. Then Craig and I spotted on the northern side of the mountain what appeared to be the ruins of an old monastery. we climbed up and found a patch of land where herbs and vegetables had been grown, and an ancient grinding stone. Instinctively, I felt that this is the place where my father had lived. It was here that he had learned yoga in a way that is different from the many other forms of yoga that are taught. Krishnamacharya's yoga is based upon the absolute respect for the individual, absolute devotion to the infinite potential which is in each one of us. It is a yoga that is always practical in matters of body, mind, and spirit. And of course, I was fully aware that this was the place where the Guru had instructed my father to go into the world and be a teacher of yoga. The place where his destiny was decided, and also mine. So that, remember when we got earlier in the story where Krishnamacharya is leaving his teacher, Rama Mohan Brahmachari, and I told you about the tradition of, like, when you leave the teacher, you don't actually pay the teacher for yoga classes or anything, or for teaching or whatever he's doing while you're with him. But when you leave, they ask for what's called a boon. And the boon can be anything from a cow to a house to a Rolls Royce. I don't know if anybody asked for a Rolls Royce, but you know what I'm saying. It's like that kind of idea. And sometimes it's a quest. Now, Krishnamacharya, just to remind you, was a high caste Brahmin from a high caste Brahmin family of priests and pandits, which are scholars and heads of universities, a very respected and high-ranking family. And his teacher said to him, I want you to go back into the world, get married, have a family, and become a yoga teacher. I think I said at the time, it's about as lowly a profession at that time as one could have, and still is. So basically a yoga teacher is a servant. Okay, so, and this is what Krishnamacharya was. He knew that he had to do what his teacher asked of him, and he went back and he did it. He married, he had a family, and he became a yoga teacher. And just to remind you, nobody was interested. Nobody was interested in yoga in 1930s India. It just wasn't happening. He couldn't earn any money, and he had to take a job on a coffee plantation to feed his family. But he still kept studying, he still kept practicing. Gradually, as we know from the story, he eventually had a stroke of luck and he became the yoga teacher to the king of Mysore. And he had a shala in the Mysore palace in, teaching yoga for the king in the school there. And from that, he gradually built his practice of teaching. And so, but this moment where Brahmachari Mahana, his teacher, says, this is what I want you to do in return for the 7 years plus of teaching I've given you. I want you to go into the world and be a yoga teacher. That is why you're here now. That's parampara. That's lineage. Every time you go into a yoga class and you do any kind of vinyasa yoga, vinyasa, you know what I mean by vinyasa yoga, I'm not going to explain it all. But every time you do that, whatever that style of yoga is called, whether it's Jiva Mukti, power yoga, vinyasa, krama, ashtanga, yoga flow, anything, whatever it might say on the tin, that yoga comes from Krishnamacharya, and that yoga comes from his teacher. And that moment where Krishnamacharya was asked as his boon to go into the world and do that is why this yoga is here now. Why? It's partly why yoga is so huge now. It's because of that moment. And that is why lineage is important. Parampara, he's calling it here, it's a traditional Sanskrit word for lineage, parampara. And that is why it's important for us to understand where yoga comes from, but also to realize that we're not just the recipients of that lineage, but we also propagate that lineage. It's up to us to continue it because it's a gift, you know. It's something we're receiving from the ancients and from teachers of the past. And everybody who passes it on, everybody who practices yoga is a teacher. You don't have to get a qualification. That's a modern thing. Go and get a piece of paper with qualification. You can do that if you want. It's great. I've got some bits of paper somewhere. You know, it's like you can do that if you want, but it isn't really what it's about. Really, to be a yoga teacher, you have to be somebody who cares about other people more than yourself and teaching them something that's going to help them in their lives. That's what a yoga teacher does. It isn't really about qualifications. And this is what Krishnamacharya says. Don't teach yoga, you know, as it applies to you. Teach it as it applies to the other. And you're all quite capable of doing that. You can be teaching people yoga. You can teach your friends. You can teach your family. And by the example and the way you live your life as a yogi, you can inspire others. So that's what a yoga teacher is, if such a thing exists. Yeah, so namaste. Thank you, Krishnamacharya.